There's a fatal mistake arrogance guarantees, the assumption that a quiet man is a weak man. In a damp Seattle alleyway in 1962, a notorious underground brawler built on raw brute force picked a street fight with a polite, bespectacled college student. He didn't realize it was Bruce Lee. Seattle in the autumn of 1962 was a city of relentless gray skies, biting sea breezes, and a gritty, unforgiving working-class underbelly. Long before the tech booms and coffee empires, the waterfront and the surrounding neighborhoods were ruled by men who worked with their hands and settled their disputes with their fists. In the underground brawling circuit of Pioneer Square, Arthur Cole was a king. Arthur was a dock worker by day and a nightmare by night, standing 6'3" and walking around at a solid 220 pounds. He was a mountain of muscle, cheap beer, and bad intentions. He wasn't a trained martial artist, nor did he possess the refined footwork of a professional boxer. What Arthur had was raw, terrifying, concussive power. He was a street fighter in the purest sense, notorious for a concrete chin that could absorb a crowbar strike and a devastating right haymaker that had literally broken the jaws of a dozen men. In the taverns and illegal basement betting rings of the Pacific Northwest, Arthur was viewed as an immovable object. He was a man who believed entirely in size and strength. To Arthur, fighting was simple physics. The bigger mass moving at a decent speed destroys the smaller mass. Period. On a particularly miserable Tuesday evening, Arthur was holding court at a smoky local pub, nursing a dark stout. His knuckles were still bruised and scabbed from a weekend fight where he had dismantled two off-duty longshoremen in a dispute over a card game. He was feeling invincible. The pub door swung open, bringing in a gust of freezing rain and his longtime sparring partner, Jimmy. Jimmy looked agitated. He bypassed the bar, walking straight over to Arthur's booth and slammed his palms on the sticky wood. "You hear about this kid operating down near the International District?" Jimmy demanded, his voice carrying over the low hum of the jukebox. Arthur took a slow sip of his beer. "I hear a lot of things, Jimmy." "Be specific." "Some young guy," Jimmy said, wiping the rain from his forehead. "College age. Skinny. Wears glasses. He set up some kind of makeshift gym in a basement, charging kids to learn Chinese kung fu. But that's not the problem." "Then what is?" Arthur asked, already bored. "The problem is what he's saying about us," Jimmy sneered. "He did a demonstration at a local cultural fair last week. Said traditional boxing is like swimming on dry land. Said Western brawlers are stiff, predictable, and fight like mechanical robots. He basically told a crowd of people that size and strength mean absolutely nothing if you don't have fluidity." Arthur's eyes narrowed. In his world, insulting the mechanics of Western boxing and street brawling was a direct insult to his livelihood and his reputation. "A skinny kid with glasses?" "Yeah," Jimmy nodded. "My brother went down to his basement to check it out. Said the guy is teaching a bunch of nobodies how to punch without winding up. Claims he can hit harder from 1 inch away than you can with a running start." Arthur let out a deep, rumbling laugh that made the glasses on the table vibrate. 1 inch? Is this a magic show or a fight gym? "He's serious, Arthur, and he's pulling guys away from the boxing clubs. People are actually believing this mystical garbage." Arthur crushed his cigarette into the glass ashtray, the embers hissing as they hit a pool of spilled beer. His ego, fragile beneath all that muscle, demanded immediate satisfaction. He didn't just want to prove this stranger wrong. He wanted to publicly humiliate him. He wanted to show the city of Seattle what real, bone-crushing power looked like against a fluid philosopher. "Get your coat, Jimmy," Arthur growled, sliding out of the booth. His massive frame shadowed the table. "Call Ray and Big Hank. We're going to take a little walk to the International District. I want to see this magic punch for myself. And then I'm going to show him what a real American right hook feels like." The 4 men walked through the freezing drizzle, a wolf pack hunting a lamb. Arthur led the charge, his massive shoulders hunched against the cold. He imagined a pretentious, arrogant fraud in silk pajamas, He imagined the satisfying crunch of cartilage when he landed his first blow. He had absolutely no concept of the storm he was casually walking into. The address Jimmy had scribbled down led them to a completely unremarkable building. There were no flashing neon signs, no grand banners, just a set of concrete steps leading down to a basement door that was propped open to let the damp night air circulate. Arthur, Jimmy, Ray, and Hank stomped down the stairs, their heavy work boots echoing ominously. Arthur pushed the door wide open and stepped inside, expecting to find a crowded room of gullible students. Instead, the basement was nearly empty. It smelled of floor wax, old canvas, and sweat. A wooden dummy with protruding arms stood in the corner. There was no boxing ring, just a series of cheap mats laid out over the concrete floor. 3 men were in the room. 2 were older, heavily built Westerners in their late 20s or early 30s. One was Jesse Glover, a seasoned judo practitioner and street-tough local who had recently become fascinated by a new way of fighting. The other was Ed Hart, a physically imposing man who looked like he knew his way around a bar fight. But Arthur's eyes locked onto the third man. Standing in the center of the mats with a push broom in his hands was a young Chinese-American man. He couldn't have weighed more than 135 pounds. He was wearing dark slacks, a crisp white button-down shirt rolled under the sleeves, and thick, black-rimmed glasses. He looked like an accounting student working a janitorial shift. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" the young man asked. His voice was polite, accented, and completely devoid of fear. Arthur stepped onto the mat with his wet boots, deliberately leading a trail of dirty water. He crossed his massive arms. "I'm looking for the guy running this ballet studio, the one who thinks boxing is a joke." Jesse Glover immediately stepped forward, his body naturally shifting into a defensive posture. "Hey, pal, step off the mats. We're closed for the night." The young man with the broom raised a hand, gently touching Jesse's shoulder. "It's okay, Jesse," he said softly. He leaned the broom against the wall and turned to face Arthur, removing his glasses and folding them neatly before placing them on a wooden bench. "I am the instructor here. My name is Bruce." Arthur let out a barking laugh. Looking back at his crew, Jimmy smirked, and Hank cracked his knuckles. "Bruce?" Arthur mocked. "You're the guy telling people my punches are mechanical. You're the one claiming you can hit harder than a heavyweight?" Arthur took another step closer, looming over Bruce. The size difference was almost comical. Arthur outweighed him by nearly 100 pounds. Bruce didn't flinch. He didn't puff out his chest. He stood perfectly relaxed, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. "I do not think your punches are a joke," Bruce said calmly. "I think they are inefficient. You rely entirely on muscular tension. It makes you slow and it telegraphs your intentions. You hit hard, I am sure, but only if your opponent is foolish enough to stand perfectly still and wait for it." Tots. And the blatant honesty in Bruce's voice infuriated Arthur more than a shouted insult would have. It was the clinical, absolute certainty in the young man's tone. He spoke to Arthur not as a threat, but as a faulty piece of machinery he was diagnosing. "Let me tell you what's going to happen, Bruce," Arthur growled, his face turning red. "You and me are going to spar. Right now. If you don't fight me, I'm going to tear this basement apart, and I'm going to come back every single night to do it again until you pack up and leave my city." Ed Hart moved to intervene, his fists clenching, but Bruce waved him off again. Bruce looked around the small basement. "The ceiling is too low here, and my students just cleaned these mats. We'll all go out to the alley." Arthur grinned, a predatory showing of teeth. "Fine by me. You might want to call an ambulance ahead of time." The group filed out into the cold, rain-slicked alleyway behind the building. The only light came from a single flickering amber street lamp humming above them. The damp chill of the Seattle night hung heavy in the air. Arthur immediately stripped off his heavy coat, revealing a torso thick with dense functional muscle. He began bouncing on his toes, throwing vicious shadow punches into the air. The sheer wind of his hooks was audible. Whoosh, Whoosh, whoosh. He was trying to intimidate the smaller man, attempting to win the fight before a single blow was thrown. Bruce walked out calmly. He didn't take off his shirt. He didn't stretch. He simply walked to the center of the alley, his dress shoes splashing lightly in a puddle. He settled into an unusual stance, his right foot and right hand forward, his knees slightly bent, his weight perfectly balanced on the balls of his feet. He looked incredibly loose, almost like water. "Whenever you are ready," Bruce said, his voice dropping an octave, losing its previous conversational warmth. His eyes, usually bright and expressive, had gone completely dead. They were the eyes of a shark. Arthur sneered. "I'm gonna take your head clean off, kid." Arthur planted his massive left boot into the wet asphalt and lunged forward. He abandoned any pretense of a tactical boxing match. He was going for a brutal, immediate knockout. He loaded up his right shoulder, pulling his arm back like a medieval siege engine, and unleashed his signature overhand righter punch that had ended dozens of fights in a fraction of a second. It was aimed squarely at Bruce's jaw, carrying 220 pounds of violent momentum. To Jimmy, Ray, and Hank, watching from the brick wall, the fight was already over. They had seen this exact sequence 100 times. Punch was too fast, the alley too narrow, the target too small. But as Arthur's fist tore through the empty air where Bruce's head had just been a millisecond before, Arthur felt a sudden, terrifying rush of cold wind on his face. He hadn't even seen the young man move. The overhand righter punch that carried enough kinetic energy to dent a car door sailed harmlessly over Bruce's left shoulder. Arthur didn't just miss. He missed so completely that his own momentum pulled him off balance, his heavy boots skidding on the wet asphalt. Before Arthur could even register the miss, let alone retract his arm to defend himself, the universe seemed to compress. Bruce hadn't merely dodged, he had slipped and entered the pocket simultaneously. It was a principle of Wing Chun and what would later become the foundation of his own martial philosophy, interception. As Arthur's arm extended, Bruce moved inside its arc. He didn't block. Blocking was a wasted motion. To Bruce, defense and offense were the exact same heartbeat. Arthur felt a sudden, sharp impact against his ribs, let hand strike so fast it was completely invisible in the dim amber light. It didn't feel like a heavy, concussive boxing glove. It felt like being struck by the heavy end of a steel whip. The snap of the blow sent a shockwave through Arthur's intercostal muscles, instantly driving the breath from his lungs in a ragged hiss. "Ugh!" Arthur grunted, his eyes widening in shock. He immediately tried to pivot, pulling his massive left arm back to throw a blind hook, hoping to catch the smaller man in a desperate clinch. If he could just grab him, Arthur thought, if he could just get his thick fingers onto that crisp white shirt, he could crush the life out of him. But Bruce wasn't there. He had already pivoted on the ball of his foot, floating to Arthur's blind side with the grace of a ballroom dancer and the precision of an assassin. As Arthur's left hook swung wildly, Bruce's right hand shot out, open palmed. He didn't punch the incoming arm, he slapped it at the forearm, parrying the strike while simultaneously stepping forward. This was the trap. In a fraction of a second, Bruce's hands became a blur. He pinned Arthur's left arm against the big man's own chest with a technique known as Pak Tao, slapping hand. Arthur, the king of the Pioneer Square docks, was suddenly neutralized. His arms were tangled in a web he couldn't understand. He felt a rising tide of panic. He was essentially wearing a straitjacket made of his own limbs, controlled entirely by a man 70 pounds lighter than him. From the sidelines, Jimmy, Ray, and Hank stood completely paralyzed. The cigarettes dropped from their lips. They weren't watching a fight, they were watching a sudden, violent surgical procedure. Jesse Glover and Ed Hart simply stood by the basement door, their expressions calm, having seen this exact scenario play out in sparring sessions dozens of times. "You are too stiff," Bruce's voice whispered, eerily calm, right next to Arthur's ear. Then came the chain punches. With Arthur's arms trapped, his center line was wide open. Bruce unleashed a barrage of straight vertical punches. Pop, 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 pop. 5 strikes landed on Arthur's sternum and jaw in the time it takes a normal man to blink twice. They weren't looping haymakers fueled by swinging shoulders. They were piston-like strikes driven entirely from the hips and the ground up, entirely devoid of muscular tension until the exact millisecond of impact. Arthur's head snapped back. Blood immediately sprayed from his nose, misting in the freezing Seattle rain. His vision blurred, swimming with white flashes. His knees buckled, but Bruce's trapping hands actually held him up, keeping the larger man precisely in the kill zone. Arthur roared, a sound of pure frustration and primal rage, and managed to violently yank his right arm free. He swung it blindly downward in a desperate hammer fist, hoping to simply smash Bruce into the pavement. Bruce released the trap, taking a half-step back. The hammer fist caught nothing but damp air. Arthur stood there, chest heaving, blood pouring down his chin, his knuckles white. He was a terrifying sight, a wounded bear ready to fight to the death. But he was also completely exposed. Bruce didn't retreat further, he didn't bounce. He slid his right foot forward, closing the distance instantly. He lowered his stance, dropping his center of gravity. His right fist was positioned vertically, exactly 1 inch away from Arthur Cole's massive sternum. Arthur looked down at the fist. It seemed like a joke. There was no wind-up, no space to generate power, fluidity, Bruce stated softly. Bruce's hips snapped, his kinetic chain from the board of his right foot, up through his calf, his thigh, twisting through his waist and exploding out through his latissimus dorsi, and triceps fired in perfect, terrifying unison. The 1-inch punch landed. The sound wasn't a fleshy thud. It was a sickening, hollow crack, like a baseball bat striking a thick slab of wet clay. Arthur's eyes rolled back. 220 pounds of hardened Street Fighter literally lifted a fraction of an inch off the wet asphalt. He didn't just fall backward, he was launched. His body flew backward 3 feet before his boots hit the ground, and then he collapsed violently onto his back, splashing into a deep puddle of dirty water. Silence descended on the alley, save for the rhythmic patter of the freezing rain. Arthur lay paralyzed, staring up at the flickering amber halo of the street lamp, gasping desperately for air that his lopped diaphragm simply refused to process. His massive chest felt as though it had been caved in by a swung sledgehammer, yet there was no bruised, battered surface flesh to indicate a brawl. It was an internal, systemic shock. The damp cold of the Seattle asphalt seeped through his soaked shirt, but he couldn't feel the chill. He could only feel the terrifying, suffocating realization of his own absolute defeat. He was drowning in it. For 10 agonizing seconds, the only sound in the alleyway was the rhythmic, hollow patter of the freezing rain hitting the corrugated tin roofs above, and the wet, desperate wheezing escaping Arthur's throat. Jimmy, Ray, and Hank finally broke from their trance-like paralysis. The cigarette Jimmy had been smoking was now just a soggy, forgotten stub on the pavement. Panic, raw and unfiltered, replaced the arrogant smirks they had worn into the alley. They sprinted across the wet asphalt, sliding to their knees beside their fallen leader. Ray, his hands visibly shaking, grabbed Arthur's broad shoulders, attempting to haul the 220-pound titan into a seated position. Arthur let out a choked, wet scream of agony, his eyes rolling back in his head as his thick fingers clawed weakly at his own ribcage. "Don't move him too fast," a voice instructed. It was steady, resonant, and entirely devoid of the adrenaline-fueled tremor that usually accompanied a street fight. Jimmy snapped his head up, his face pale, eyes wide with a mixture of profound terror and incomprehensible awe. Bruce Lee was standing exactly where he had planted his feet to deliver the final strike. His breathing was completely even, his chest rising and falling in a slow, rhythmic cadence. Not a single drop of sweat beaded on his forehead. The crisp white button-down shirt he wore wasn't torn, stretched, or even wrinkled. He looked exactly as he had 5 minutes prior, sweeping a basement floor. Slowly, methodically, Bruce reached into his dark slacks, produced a neatly folded, pale handkerchief, and wiped a single, microscopic speck of dirt from his right knuckle. His sternum is bruised, and it is highly probable he has a hairline fracture on his third rib, Bruce stated clinically. His tone held absolutely no malice, no gloating, and no arrogance. He was diagnosing a machine he had just dismantled. He is experiencing a severe disruption of the autonomic nervous system due to the concentrated kinetic impact. Let him catch his breath. If you force him up now, he will choke on his own panic. Hank looked from the groaning giant on the pavement to the slight bespectacled college student wiping his hands. His jaw hung slack. What the hell did you just hit him with? Hank stammered, his voice cracking. You didn't even swing, you didn't move your shoulder. That's impossible. Bruce carefully folded the handkerchief and returned it to his pocket. He looked at the three stunned dock workers. He wasn't looking at enemies. He was looking at men blinded by a flawed philosophy. I didn't need to swing, Bruce explained, the rain beginning to plaster his dark hair to his forehead. Power does not come from the sheer mass of the muscle, nor does it come from a wide, telegraphic wind-up. That is an illusion sold to you by heavy bags and willing opponents. True power comes from the speed of the contraction and the perfect, instantaneous alignment of the skeletal structure. Ruse gestured slightly to Arthur, who was finally managing to pull shallow, ragged breaths into his lungs. Your friend fights like an old oak tree. He is deeply rooted, exceptionally strong, heavy, and immovable. He relies on his bark to take the damage. But when the hurricane comes, the oak tree does not bend. It fights the wind, and eventually the oak tree snaps. Bruce turned on his heel, the leather soles of his dress shoes tapping softly, deliberately, on the wet pavement as he walked back toward the warm glow of the basement entrance. Just before he crossed the threshold, he stopped and looked over his shoulder, the dim amber light catching the sharp contours of his jawline. You must be like the bamboo, Bruce said, his voice lowering to a whisper that somehow carried perfectly over the rain. You must learn to bend with the wind, to yield to overwhelming force rather than matching it, and to strike back with the devastating speed of the snap. Tell your friend, when his chest is healed and his breathing returns, he is welcome in my class, but he must leave his ego in the alley. Bruce stepped down into the basement. Jesse Glover and Ed Hart, who watched the entire violent ballet with quiet reverence, firmly pulled the heavy wooden door shut. The metallic click of the deadbolt echoing in the alley sounded like a judge's gavel. Left alone in the freezing Seattle rain, Jimmy and Ray, carefully, agonizingly, hauled Arthur to his feet. The undisputed king of Pioneer Square leaned heavily on his two friends, his muscular legs trembling like a newborn calf's. He spat a thick mouthful of bloody saliva onto the asphalt and stared at the closed basement door. The blazing fury, the entitlement, and the absolute arrogance that had driven him across town were completely gone. In their place was a profound, humbling, and utterly devastating shock. Arthur had walked down those concrete steps believing he was the apex predator of the city, the top of the food chain in a world of violence. He walked out realizing he was practically prehistoric, a lumbering dinosaur rendered utterly obsolete in the span of 30 terrifying seconds. The walk back to the pub was silent. There was no boasting, no laughter, no clinking of glasses, just the heavy, dragging footsteps of a broken king. The story of that Tuesday night spread through the underground fight clubs, the smoky longshoreman bars, and the boxing gyms of the Pacific Northwest, like a wildfire fueled by gasoline. In an era before cell phone cameras and the internet, the oral tradition of the streets took over. Naturally, the exaggerations grew with every retelling over cheap beer. Down at the Blue Moon Tavern, some claimed Bruce had knocked the giant out was just a fierce glare and a flick of his wrist. Over at the shipyards, rumors circulated that the Chinese kid moved so fast he literally vanished, striking Arthur from 3 different directions at once. But beneath the mythological embellishments, the core undeniable truth remained, striking a chord of fear and intense curiosity into every seasoned fighter who heard it. Arthur Cole, the untouchable, iron-jawed titan of the docks, had been entirely dismantled without landing a single blow. Hospitalized by a 1-inch strike from a college kid wearing slacks, Arthur never did return to the basement to take a class. His bruised sternum healed in a matter of weeks, but his shattered pride proved fatal to his lifestyle. His identity was inextricably tied to being the biggest, baddest man in the room. He couldn't stomach the transition from a master of the streets to a white belt beginner standing in the back row of a basement. He slowly, quietly faded from the local brawling circuit. He became a ghost of his former self, a man who flinched at sudden movements, forever haunted by the memory of a relaxed fist sitting exactly 1 inch from his chest. However, the true, lasting impact of that cold, wet alleyway encounter wasn't the destruction of Arthur Cole's reputation. The true impact was the profound psychological and philosophical shift it triggered within Bruce Lee. That night was a crucible. It was a violent, undeniable proof of concept for the young martial artist, but it was also a glaring warning sign. Bruce realized that while his classical Wing Chun forms were devastatingly effective against a slow, predictable brawler, the real world of street combat was chaotic, messy, and unrestricted. He analyzed the fight in the days that followed. He realized that against a faster, equally skilled opponent of Arthur's size, the rigid classical stances might have failed him. He began to ruthlessly refine his teachings. He started stripping away the ornate classical movements of traditional kung fu. He removed any technique that wasn't directly contributing to immediate survival and absolute devastating practicality. He trained his students not just to punch, but to intercept the opponent's intent before the strike even materialized. He stopped teaching the rigid curriculum of Chinese kung fu and began the relentless physical and intellectual journey that would eventually birth his own revolutionary expression of combat, Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. The docks of Seattle would continue to breed tough, heavy-handed brawlers, men who blindly trusted the crude, flawed physics of mass and brute force. But in a quiet, unassuming basement, surrounded by a small, fiercely loyal group of diverse students, a young man was actively changing the very physics of hand-to-hand combat. He was proving, one broken ego at a time, that the most dangerous weapon on earth wasn't a clenched heavy fist or a steel-toed boot. It was a mind that flowed like water, ready to crash like a wave. If you were captivated by this untold story of martial arts history and the moment a street legend was born, don't keep it to yourself. Hit that like button to show your support. Share this incredible tale of skill-conquering brute force with your friends, and make sure to subscribe to the channel for more thrilling, real-life combat stories every single week. Stay fluid.